Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to today's Maniac Talk. As usual, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome our speaker, Dr. Sara Ann Tangren, a regional expert on the conservation and creation of upland meadows habitat. Sara, every year, provides annual training for myriad master gardeners who are trained to educate citizens about effective and sustainable horticultural practices. She follows up with them each year to provide updates on new trends, methods of gardening, pollinators, and the onset of invasive species or harmful diseases. Today, she's going to talk about her own journey. She's going to talk about her own journey, in her own words, which is characterized by obstacles and opportunities that repeatedly led her to choose the road less traveled. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Sara Tangren.
All right, so we're going to talk about your new meadow. Have you noticed it out there? It's right in front of your building, kind of hard to miss. Looks like a big mud pit right now, but it has a promising future. So this is really weird. No one's ever asked me to talk about myself before. So if I seem a little more uncomfortable than usual, it's because I don't do that. But given the context, I thought I would say that when I was 8, I got to attend the Apollo 11 launch. And so that was a super exciting thing for a little kid to be doing. When I was 13, I read this article in Physics Today, and it was all about how we were going to have colonies in space, and we were going to be growing our own food and recycling our water, and it just completely captured my imagination, mostly because there were pictures, and that I don't think I got the text or the graphs or anything like that, but there were some really cool pictures in there. And I did go to school. I've been to Penn State, SUNY Stony Brook, and the University of Maryland. And here I am graduating with my degree in soil science from my advisor, Delvin Fanning, right here at Maryland. So I haven't gone very far away from there. I had a career in environmental consulting. And the type of consulting that I did was for developers before they developed the property. And they needed an environmental expert to go out and kind of quantify what kind of plant communities were there really valuable forests that should not be developed, and were there wetlands. And that was most of the work, because wetlands are very important for maintaining our water quality, and they're particularly important habitat. So this was my job. I would literally go out in the woods alone. I was out there alone for years, coming back for meals, of course, always coming back in for meals. And that's what I would do. I would hang these flags on trees that would tell the developers there are wetlands on this side and uplands on that side. And then they would make these maps. And this would allow them to design the development plan for that property. Now, this is where my career starts to arc toward working more with native meadows. Because if you think about it, if you set aside some of the forest and you set aside the wetland, what is left is upland meadow. So unintended consequences of the things we do, right? These conservation programs actually intensify the destruction of native meadows. In fact, sometimes we'll even take a native meadow and plant trees in it and call it forest mitigation, when in fact, native meadows are the rarest habitat type in the United States. This is one of the development sites I worked at in the 1990s, and the construction equipment literally with a bucket load of native sunflowers, and they're just clearing the native meadows out. So that was like my personal experience and what I could see with my own eyes. But if we look at this on a statewide scale, and I know you tend to think on, a national or a global scale, but because I work for the University of Maryland Extension, I think very much on a statewide scale. So the first European colonists to arrive in Maryland would have seen landscapes that look something like this, completely blanketed as far as you could see in native vegetation. And so some of the earliest NASA satellites captured this data on what the vegetation looked like in 1600. They totally didn't get that. Okay, and if you represent the native vegetation in green and you mapped it, it would look like this. 350 years later, it looks like this. And this is an actual map from the Maryland Department of Planning. Here we have the agriculture in tan and urban and suburban areas in red. Now, the thing that agriculture and urban suburban areas have in common is that they are blanketed with alien vegetation. So with the crops, it's wheat and soybeans and corn from South America. And with the urban suburban areas, if we have vegetation at all, it's usually a lawn. We grow more lawn in the state of Maryland than any other crop, more lawn than corn. This is the trend, and it continues. So as Gatebi mentioned, we're teaching sustainable landscaping in our program. The Master Gardeners are teaching sustainable landscaping. Can you imagine if the red areas on this map cleaned the water that runs off of them instead of making it dirtier? Could you imagine if those red areas supported native plants and pollinators instead of getting rid of them? And another cool thing we do is we teach people how to grow their own food. What if those red areas represented people and small businesses growing their own food? That would mean a lot to our state. So, back to me, which is the most interesting part, yes. So all of this influenced where I went with my career. But before you can really understand that, I'm just going to run three concepts, sort of three things about ecology by you. Native plants, what are they? They are the plants that evolved in your region. Now that's kind of leaving you there going, what's my region, right? The whole definition hangs on that. Well, the region is the one that you are from that has fairly consistent growing conditions. So fairly consistent geology, fairly consistent climate, and the plant and animal community tends to be fairly consistent across the region. The EPA has made maps of these regions. So this is EPA Level 3 ecoregion. They're called ecoregions. And let's see, yes. If we were to say approximately where the Goddard Space Flight Center is, which ecoregion that is in, is this sort of tan color here. And locally we call it the Western Shore, right? It's a Western Coastal Plain or the Western Shore. It's home, we know it pretty well. What a native plant then for you in this location is, if you are shopping for native plants or wild collecting for native plants, means that you want to stay within the Western Shore ecoregion. And on top of that, you really can't go too far north or too far south. So how many of you have heard of plant hardiness zones? You've seen that USDA map? Okay, so they say don't go more than half a plant hardiness zone, and they is the USDA, US Forest Service. Don't go more than half a plant hardiness zone north or south of your location, because then you get things that are not well adapted to your climate. If you take all of that information together, the region from which we would select native plants for a project at Goddard looks very much like the sorting hat from Harry Potter. So we're going to be coming back to that when we get in specifically to talk about your meadow. The second concept is, why are native plants important? Okay, so how many of you saw this movie? Silent Running? You're giving it a 0 or an okay? 0. Excellent, me too. There are 2 people in this audience who have seen this movie. Okay, totally recommend it. Now, at the time it came, she's looking at me like, no. Okay, I totally recommend this. At the time it came out, it really didn't get awesome reviews. It was like, well, that was kind of good. It is now considered one of the top 10 science fiction movies of all time and has been awarded classic status by the British Film Institute. So we were right. So this film, and I want to say this without doing a spoiler, right? Because you're all probably going to want to watch it now. This film really asks the question, are plants important at all? Once plants cease to provide us as humans with some sort of direct benefit, are they important at all? And I bring this up not only because this talk is really about me, and I love the film, but also because ecologists are in this situation where I think many of us, most of us, see some inherent value in these miraculous plants. I mean, I would love native plants if they did nothing for humanity. I would still be a huge fan. I think they're awesome. But, you know, other people have other things that they're excited about. And so ecologists are often in this position of saying, well, native plants are important because they are the very best thing. For example, it's sequestering carbon, cleaning water, supporting pollinators. They help in that way to produce our food, and so forth and so on. So we have all of these reasons that we can give you why native plants are important. One of the most critical is that native plants are the underpinning of the natural world. Without them, the food web literally collapses. So specifically, the insects, after millions of years of evolving with the plants, they've had to make trade-offs. Metabolically, you know, I'm capable of digesting this type of plant tissue, but it's not possible to also be capable of digesting that type of plant tissue. So huge numbers, thousands and thousands of native insects must have a specific type of native plant or they literally cease to exist. And so this is not an uncommon thing. This is the rule. This is how it works. And if you lose the native insects, you lose the native songbirds, which require those for their diet. And actually, the whole system just collapses. And the third concept, what is a meadow, right? So a meadow is a place where the trees don't grow, basically. And so it's dominated by some grasses and some flowers. And we have places that trees can't grow because they're too cold or they're too rocky, that sort of thing. But most of our native meadows are actually places where there was some sort of natural disaster. Now that's putting a very human perspective on the event, right? That a fire is a natural disaster. Because what actually happens here is that when the trees go, these just gorgeous native meadows come up, and all kinds of animals, butterflies, birds that could not live in this space otherwise can live there during the time period that the trees move back in. So that's what meadows are. And that concept's going to be important when we come to talk to your meadow. So back to how this influenced my career in moving more towards native meadows. I did two things, and as someone who was seeing this firsthand. And the first was to start a wildflower farm. Were any of you ever at the wildflower farm? It was in Anne Arundel County. Okay. It was really neat. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite things that I've ever done. 2 acres of native grasses and wildflowers. And there were pollinators that could best be described as clouds. Clouds of pollinators. It was so much fun. Hard, a little hard on the back, but lots of fun. And it was an oddity because I live in the mid-Atlantic. Any place else in the country, this would not have attracted attention. I was on the cover of every single newspaper's gardening section, not the front cover. That was usually bad news, don't want to be there. But on the cover of every single major newspaper in our area, several magazines, and also the newspapers that the farmers, they have their own newspapers, on the front page of those twice, because it was, and the farmers would come, and they would come with their pickup trucks, and they would watch me. And they'd stand around and they'd watch me. And the reason for this is that older farmers still remember when those plants were the things they couldn't get out of their fields. Yeah, so. The other thing I did that was really a response to the native meadow issue was to become involved in the conservation of this rare wildflower. And the University of Maryland Arboretum financed so that I could go out and do a study to see what the status was. And just like so many native plants, there's a butterfly that relies upon these sundial lupins. And as the sundial lupins disappear from the landscape, this gorgeous little butterfly disappears along with it. So that brings me roughly up to how it was that we came to be running a master gardener class here to create a native meadow. Nowadays, I work for the University of Maryland Extension. How many of you know what Extension is? That's impressive, okay? So like a quarter of you. Before I actually worked for them, I couldn't figure it out. But what it is, the land-grant universities have the normal university responsibilities of doing research and teaching college students. But the land-grant universities also have the responsibility of making sure that any useful scientific information gets out to the general public. After all, they do pay the bills. Within Extension, I work for a group called the Home and Garden Information Center. And that's a half of our staff right there. We serve over 6 million people. Now, I'm just going to mention this. It has nothing to do with your meadow, but it affects you personally. Because on our website, there is this wonderful button. If you have any question about plants or pests in your home or garden, you just click on that button. And I'm going to give you a handout in a minute that has the URL for this. This is so useful, they will normally have your answer within 24 hours. You can even send them pictures. So we have that aspect to the Home and Garden Information Center. We are also the department responsible for training the master gardeners. Master gardeners are experts that take basically a boot camp, an internship of intense horticultural training, and then once they graduate, they serve the citizens of Maryland with a minimum of 40 years of volunteer work every year. Last year, this generated $3 million worth of service to the citizens of Maryland. They also, and this is getting closer to your meadow topic, they also take advanced training classes. And in this photograph, that's me. Can't you tell? Yeah, it's obvious. And these master gardeners, and we are actually out studying a native meadow. In fact, this native meadow was bulldozed and is now a housing subdivision. So this was late 2013, I think. Master gardeners also, once they've had their training and their advanced training, they go out, they develop their own extension programs. They find a public need that they fill and develop their own program. This master gardener on the left here is teaching high school students how to grow their own food, specifically how to grow potatoes in bags. And more recently, some of our master gardeners are producing native seed, and that brings me to the first handout. So this is some of the native seed that the master gardeners have grown, and it is black-eyed Susan seed, and you might think, well, that's kind of ordinary or common. This is a very, very special black-eyed Susan seed. It is from the wild. It was wild collected and grown by the master gardeners in a plot like you see here, and then they harvested and cleaned the seed. The point of this is that you could not go out and buy this. So we want to start educating and supporting people that they can have real wildflower seed from their area. And who knows, maybe even support some farmers who want to produce seed, or some nurseries that want to grow native plants from the seed. And this brings us to the Meadow Project, right? So I'm always looking for, master gardeners are actually really very demanding people. And I'm always looking for like really exciting, cutting edge kind of classroom opportunities. And in the office, I've been getting calls from the general public, from homeowners associations, highway departments, monarch conservation groups, just like once a week, someone saying, come out and show us how to do a native meadow, which I cannot do because my job is to teach master gardeners, right? And so Janine and Darlene were looking at, and this gets into the very first part of creating a meadow. Step number 1 of 6 steps is to do your planning. So through the planning process, and spot me here if I was like totally wrong, I got that mowing the lawn was more expensive than the budget really allowed for. So it'd be great if we could spend less money on mowing. That's a good way to put it? Okay. And also the constant fossil fuel burping, polluting, people can't breathe, constant source of noise wasn't really the best. Look for the front of the Earth Sciences building, right? So that was their goal. And my goal, of course, was like, is there some way that I can satisfy this public need that's very clearly being identified for me by teaching a master gardener class? So we've teamed up to teach the class here, and Bill is filming the class for us so that not only do we have the classes here, we have the film, and we're going to create a MOOC. So a massive open online course. So look for that. You've got our URL on your handout. Look for that this winter, probably very early 2018. In case you're thinking about creating meadows on your own properties, which I hope you are. So planning is the beginning of any kind of project, not just a meadow project. And you're thinking, what are my goals, which we've just outlined, and what are my resources, right? And then you kind of do an overview and you set out the steps you're going to take, and then reality happens, but it was probably a good plan anyhow. Site preparation is the next step, and this is the step that if you are thinking about creating your own native meadow, or how many of you are thinking, no, maybe I would do, some of us, and the others are just like, why is there a mud pit in front of the building? Yeah, okay. Yeah, what is that about? All right, this is the step that you're going to be sorely tempted to skip. All right, site preparation. There are two things you've got to do. You've got to kill the existing lawn, the living plants, and you've got to kill the seeds that those lawn grasses have built up in that soil for decades. Thousands and thousands and thousands, millions and billions of seeds in the soil, right? And if you just add some native seed to that, it's not going to become a native meadow. It's going to be a disaster. So we killed Phil and Janine and some other people from Code 250, stripped the sod. So that's how they killed the living plants. Then we killed the seed bank by putting this black plastic on it and letting it sit out in the summer sun. Hot, it gets hot under that plastic, right? In Maryland in August, that is a hot place to be. Nonetheless, you know, soil has a tremendous heat capacity, so only the very, very surface of the soil will have the dead seeds in it, right? So an inch down, 6 inches down, those seeds are probably fine. We're going to be coming back to that. We did another thing for site preparation that's pretty unique. That soil out there is so incredibly compacted, I think you could get a certification to build a road on it without doing any further work. So we planted forage radishes. Forage radishes, those tap roots have a unique ability to go down in that hard soil and bust it up. And then they die in the winter. Did you all smell that when they died? You smelled it. Did anyone else notice the smell? They smelled like you just opened a container that had broccoli in it or something. Yeah, so not horribly pleasant. They die and then they leave this network of channels behind. And that allows the subsequent plants, your plants, to grow into those channels and to get to more soil. Super important because plants do that to literally physically reach their nutrients and their water. So if it's so tight in there and they can only grow in this tiny space, they can't reach those things and they die. Now, these forage radishes are known to go down 4 feet through compact soil. There are videos online with people like holding these huge things. Your soil is so compact, they went down about 4 inches. So we might want to do it again. I don't know. We should talk about it. Planning is adaptive management, right? Yeah. So back to the sorting hat. Where are things native? So the next step is you have to select the native seeds that you're going to use for your project. And if you lived anywhere else in the country, this would consist of going to the website or getting the catalog from the native plant seed production company and picking what matches with your growing conditions. But now we're going to zoom out a little bit here. Here's our ideal native region for getting native plants and native seeds. Those red stars are where the companies are that we could order native seed from. So we were out of luck. Now these white stars up here in Pennsylvania and New Jersey are companies that are just starting to produce native seeds, and so maybe, right, but not yet. So plan B in this case is to go to a native meadow in your area or a couple of native meadows and collect very small quantity of seed. Now, we're only doing 4,000 square feet. It's 1/10 of an acre. It's really a very tiny meadow. Literally a fistful of wild seed contains thousands and thousands of seeds. So it's plenty. You don't need to collect a whole lot. And so we have Janine and Darlene out here, and you have to scout for your seed collection sites while the flowers are blooming, because once they turn brown and they're ripe seeds, they're really hard to find. And this is an example. Black-eyed Susans, you know, when they're blooming, look something like this. When they've gone to seed, they look like this. So if you're scouring over a few acres trying to find the black-eyed Susan seed, this little brown ball down here under the grass cover can be very hard to see. So that is how we made our species selections. We said what meadows are around here, and fortunately with bark and NASA properties so close together, we were able to find a few native meadows. The next step in creating a native meadow is to sow the seed. Now, if you're doing acres, you're going to use a machine. They're very special machines for this. But if you're doing really anything that's only like 1 acre or even 2 acres, you can't even get those machines calibrated on 2 acres. So you're going to be sowing that seed by hand. And the simplest way to do that is to take that basically fistful of seed and mix it in with a tremendous quantity of damp sand. Because otherwise, you know, you'll just throw it and it'll all be in one place. And you have to distribute it evenly over the area where you want it. And there's a little wrist thing. You got to really get it going on, and it just sort of sprays the sand and the seed. It just fans it out over a very large area. And so I tell the master gardeners this, right, in the classroom, but because of our partnership with you, then they get to go out and actually do it. And it is, you know, harder than it sounds to not just make little piles of sand all over the place, and that's not what you want. Then you have to rake that into the soil. Most species you don't just want laying on top of the soil. You want to actually rake them in. And this where that thing where I said that black plastic only killed just a little bit right at the surface, don't rake deeply. You do not want to rake deeply. Very light raking. And, you know, clearly Janine needed to instruct people on how to do the raking. No, she was a good worker. Once you've done that, you've kind of fluffed the surface up, and then you have to roll it in, because seeds actually need to be touched by the soil very tightly, because all of their water and their nutrients come from that physical contact with the soil. So you kind of have to tamp it down. This is called a roller, and you can rent it anywhere that you rent other equipment. So this brings us to where we are at the moment with the native meadow. We are waiting to see if the seeds we sowed germinated or not. So this is like the stressful part, right? Because you just don't get to know. There are some things in life you just don't get to know until they happen. Well, we have a little security, because what we did is we planted some of the seed in pots. So when it germinates in the pot, at least we have the comfort of knowing that the seed was good, right? That still doesn't mean it's going to come up in the meadow, but at least we know that the seed was good. And I'll go ahead and pass these two around so that you can see the native grasses. So those are yarrow. That's American yarrow. And the grass there is wild rye, which is a relative of our native rye. Or excuse me, it's a native relative of the rye that we eat. This is the list of species that, through our process, we chose and wild collected and planted in the meadow. So this would be a fantastic list if you're within this area and you're considering doing a meadow. This is a great native meadow species list. Very common species in our area. Some of them are very showy. A few milkweeds in there because we want to support the monarchs, all of that. Which brings us to the current moment. This is when we begin the monitoring and the maintenance. And it's hard to say what the maintenance will consist of until you've done the monitoring and identified what the problem might be. So we don't know what the problem is yet. I've done a few meadows, no problems at all. In which case, the maintenance just consists of, so remember earlier when we said what are meadows, right? And for a lot of them, meadows are places where the fire killed the trees. And so one way to maintain a meadow is to burn it periodically. And this is in fact what Anne Arundel County Parks does to maintain the native meadows that they have planted. And you might be thinking, well, that's fine for out in the middle of your park. This is immediately adjacent to a subdivision. So the homeowners are on board with this. So I would submit to you that burning your meadow would be a lot more fun. We could have a barbecue, we could invite the fire department, right? That would be a lot more fun. But if you don't want to do that, then you can mow it. But that, you know, you mow it so infrequently. What the regimen will vary a little bit depending on what, while we're monitoring it, we decide what we like and what's happening and so forth. But it will probably be something like we mow 1/3 of the meadow every year. In other words, you could say, we're going to mow the meadow every 3 years. But you don't want to mow the whole thing, right? Because your pollinators are actually living in there and overwintering in there. So you want to give them some meadow to, like, oh, what are they doing? And they run away, and they hide in the part that you didn't mow. Yeah, because this is partly about saving the pollinators, right? So you don't mow the whole thing every year. Janine and Darlene have written a really cool webpage. So if you wanted to know, like, step by step exactly what they were doing out there, you can go to this webpage. And the Master Gardeners are having the class over again. The whole 6-step process is happening over again. The town of Middletown in Maryland. Is anyone from Frederick County? You live in Frederick County? No? Okay, well that's where it is. So if you know anybody that wants to take the class, it is now open for public registration. And we have time for questions. Yeah, did everyone get one of the seed packet handouts? There. I would just ask that you not plant those black-eyed Susans on the campus at Goddard. Take them home and plant them because you have your own wild black-eyed Susan population, which is pretty cool. And you never know, maybe someday we'll do something with it. So, yeah.
So I have 2 questions. The first is that slide you showed of the matter that you all were working on, but then you said that the housing development was there no, how did that happen? What was the history of that? How come they, you know, there was just the zoning that allowed for that, or you went through a lot of work apparently to get that meadow going, but then it sounded like it didn't last.
So I would love to take credit for this meadow, but I was only a visitor. Anne Arundel County Parks has been doing native meadows for a while now. And whether the housing subdivision came in before the meadow or after the meadow, I don't know.
Well, I guess I was referring to the earlier slide where you all said that you were working on a meadow that wasn't there anymore.
You said it.
Yeah, the master
like half of your staff.
Oh, yes. Yes. Now I know what you're talking about. So we took the Master Gardener class to the meadow for advanced training. That slide. Yes. So, and thank you for asking that because this gives me an opportunity. You know, you can listen to this talk and think that I'm like opposed to developers or development. And I'm not. In fact, I've had tremendously positive experiences with that community. And this is an example of that. This site already slated for development when we were there, and the developers gave us permission to come onto the property and teach classes. So it was slated for development before the class. In fact, the class is actually a class on something called plant rescue, how to organize a plant rescue. And so that is something that you do when a property is slated for development. And organizing one is a project. If you have volunteers coming and you have to identify the plants at whatever time of year and so forth and so on. So that was what the class was, and the landowners, knowing that, gave us permission to come and have the class and hold a plant rescue. So very cool community.
Burn a meadow to help in its maintenance. Do you burn the whole thing every year, and what time of year do you do the burn?
You know, I suspect that you would burn, for a very small meadow like the one we have right now, that you would burn the whole thing. Because that's a lot of work to set up for the burn. You're not going to burn 1,000 square feet each year. But ultimately, if Goddard decides to do more meadows, there's so much lawn here. You could convert acres into meadow. Then yes, you probably burn, you know, an acre here and an acre there and not burn the other ones. And generally the burns are done during the dormant season. My inclination is to do it before the migratory birds show up. And historically, that has been around March 15th. Now, you know, our migration patterns, our blooming phenology, everything's a little off because of climate change. So if I were actually managing a meadow like that, I would probably be watching the bird migrations. But yeah, I like to do it before the birds come in, because there are whole species of birds that you won't have on your campus without the meadow. But once you have the meadow, they're going to come and they're going to nest in the clumps of grasses in the meadow.
That if you burn, that clump it's not going to be there till the next season. But so you would do between winter and spring, not fall. So between winter and spring, and
yeah, like Valentine's Day.
Will come back that year, but they won't
They
be
do.
there, say in April, like now. They'll be there.
Right. So if you didn't burn the whole meadow, then, you know, the birds can go to the other parts. But if you're faced with, like, this is my whole meadow and I'm either going to burn it or not, you're absolutely right. You would be removing the nesting material.
So hardiness zones presumably are changing as a result of climate change and things of that nature. So if you're going to put in something that you hope will last for a few decades, how do you plan for that?
We have changed our recommendations for master gardeners who are planting trees. And basically, if you look at the native range of the tree, because when you plant a tree, you're really not planting it for yourself unless you're very young, right? You're not going to sit in the shade of that tree. You do that for the next generation. So if you look at the natural range of a tree, like sugar maple is a good example, Maryland, and only part of Maryland for that matter, the mountainous part and north central Maryland is part of the natural range of sugar maple. Incredible tree. I mean, maple syrup, right? Fall color. We love this tree. With the more aggressive scenario for climate change, in other words, we don't begin to curb our emission behaviors now. If we continue to behave the way that we've been behaving, sugar maple will disappear from Maryland. So we would not recommend to a master gardener that they plant a sugar maple under that scenario. Under the scenario where we really begin to change our behavior now, sugar maples will remain part of Maryland's flora. It will decrease in how common it is. In some of our woods, it can be up to 50% sugar maple in some areas. So it'll be maybe 30% in those areas.
As a follow-up for the meadows and the list of plants and things that you have here, would any of that change into these scenarios as well?
Yes, so no, I think with the meadow plants, the lifespan is fairly short, and also we're recommending a mix of 24 species. So what we would look for is if any of those species were right at the southern end of the range of their natural distribution, that might be one we would lose over time. But on the other hand, I mean, really we just said, hey, where are the flowers? And came back in a couple weeks and grabbed a few seeds. So it's not the same level of investment as when you get a tree going. Sorry, I'm just not going to call on you. I'm sorry. I'll get to you next.
I was just wondering, about the pairing and all that, and getting the non-native species out and settled, but then if your property is surrounded by non-native species, they're going to encroach
Yes.
back in. So it's an ongoing battle, I guess.
Yes, and that is part of the meadow planning class. In the planning phase, you examine the site for what we call meadow killers. So if the site you've picked is like right adjacent to a forest, and that forest is full of Bradford pear, sweet gum, so Bradford pear is alien, right? So we're just like an invasive sort, it's just like, we don't want that in the meadow. But also some native trees like sweet gum and black cherry, they will seed in your meadows so heavily. And this is where the mowing and the fire and goats, can come in to control the woody vegetation. Or a really, really good way to plant a forest. Because I'll tell you, meadows are awesome and they're great for pollinators and they're really good at sequestering carbon. But a forest is even better at sequestering carbon. So this is actually a way you could look at it and say, hey, maybe I want to plant a forest. I'll start by planting the meadow, but then I just won't mow it, or I'll only mow part of it, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's in the planning phase. You have to address that. There you are.
Yeah, I was actually going to make a comment. If anyone would like to see the creation of a meadow, I understand you're talking about creating a meadow in a short period of time,
Yes.
less than the human lifetime. But if you go up to Research Road, there was a dense forest there about 50 years ago, and a stream flowing through it.
Okay.
And this is where the farm gate is between Greenbelt and the agricultural farm.
Okay.
Well, the beavers came in, dammed up the stream. Over about 10 years or so, I've killed the forest. Trees fell down. Clumps of grass, vegetation, weeds, whatever, have grown up around the tree stumps. They're still there. You can barely see them. It's
Right.
about 10 or 15 acres or so, being slowly turned into a meadow.
Yes,
So come back in about 50, 70 years.
So that's the perfect example of, from the forest perspective, a natural disaster because they got flooded very abruptly and it kills the trees. But the habitat that comes in and will fill that void until the beavers move on and the land drains again is just amazing.
And there's bald eagles there.
Bald eagles, amazing.
So what happens if we just stop mowing? Like, there's so much to mow here, why don't we just stop?
So, yeah, right? So there could be an argument for that, but it wouldn't be one that supports pollinators or it cleans the water. Also, those turf grasses, that's what's going to happen. If you stop mowing, the turf grass will get taller, and then it will flower. And a large percentage of us are violently allergic to that. And it's windblown, it's windborne. So people who don't mow their lawns are just making us miserable in the spring. So I highly recommend mowing a lawn if a lawn is what you've got.
Kind of along similar lines, so some
Oh, and it's ugly. I just totally forgot to, it just looks like no one takes care of this place. It looks like people don't mow their lawn.
Where's our meadow?
It's not really pretty just yet. Yeah, no, it's not going to look like an unmowed lawn.
Okay, because that was part of my question. Some neighborhoods like have laws, like, neighborhood rules or whatever that you can't not have a lawn.
Yes.
You can't have like a wild area because it looks like not tidy.
Right.
So I guess what would be the process in trying to get a meadow, or do you have to like move somewhere where that's not an issue, or?
Yeah, well, that's a thought, right? That's a thought. I'm just going to move. These people don't get it. So one of the things that I hope we're doing with this project is to begin to increase the acceptance of converting some lawn to meadow, and that will include gaining an eye for appreciation of what's going on in the meadow. Learning to see native grasses, actually, as it just happens, I don't know why, but when they go to seed and they turn brown at the end of the year, they're gorgeous. They're absolutely beautiful. And seeing the beauty of the native flowers, and these are not garden flowers. They have not been bred to have the biggest, showiest, so it's not going to look like pink wave petunias, right? Which I do think have their place, but it's going to look very natural, and then you're going to see the pollinators that come to those plants and the birds that come, because that's the food web. I mean, they come because you put the native plants out. And so I think it's partly that, partly changing our aesthetic by demonstrating the practice. But also when you plan a meadow, you need to be aware of that, right? That is going to happen. And so that's why Janine and Darlene put out that gorgeous sign, right? And they told you, why does the front of my building look like that? Why does it look like that? That's not a great look. It looks like a mud pit right now, and then for a while it looked like plastic. But even eventually, once the meadow plants are coming up, they're going to maintain the perimeter a little bit differently, so that you don't just have like some 7-foot tall grass that's flopped down over the sidewalk, because they're used to growing in communities. And so they're going to focus on making the perimeter especially attractive and interpreting what's going on with signs. You have to engage the community, absolutely.
You want to say something about the form?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things about my job is that whenever I give a talk, I have to ask the audience to evaluate whether or not I did well. And then I'm not allowed to ever see the forms again. So they all have to go back to the basket on the desk, and Gatibi will take care of them for me.
In the past, I've been involved with prescribed burning, and the thing is if you're thinking of actually using burning it's a sorry, if you're actually thinking of using burning as part of your management strategy, Goddard has people that can deal with this, but there's all sorts of regulatory stuff. Do yourself a favor, go sit and chat with the local fire marshal and find out what the local regs are, so that they don't show up with a whole bunch of people saying, "What are you doing?"
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So, but there's a lot of communities which are actually very proactive in allowing this, but it's something you need to handle. A second question. You listed a bunch of species here. Are you interested in connecting with people that are doing plant propagation and with native plants?
Absolutely, absolutely. Very interested in the plant propagation, the nursery community, with farmers who are interested in producing seeds or are producing seeds. Absolutely. Yeah, so with the fire, if there's anyone in your chain, in your project chain, that isn't into it, I think you really can't do it.
Last question, yeah.
So do you have on your website something like
the backyard, the backyard meadow, obviously I'm not gonna have a fire in my backyard, and I don't have to go, but, I mean, so she commented maybe the front yard, maybe the housing would have a problem, but the backyard, I mean, it's a way for homeowners to just.
Yes. Yes, so what we're going to do first is we're going to get that MOOC on this winter. And so you will actually be able to watch the planning process and watch the seed harvesting process. You'll get to see the whole picture. Now, you would be implementing it on a smaller scale, but your considerations are the same.
Okay, let's thank Sarah one more time.
Thank you.